Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with David Larkins, the line editor for Pendragon, and we talked about heroism in tabletop role-playing games. There are so many good characters in tabletop role-playing games with interesting gray areas of morality, but there's also a lot of iconic and really exciting characters that are hardline, that are always making the good option and always taking the virtuous approach. I think there's a really interesting dynamic to be explored there. And considering that Pendragon is a game which focuses very heavily on morality and chivalry and ideas like that, I asked David to give me his insight on the topic. I started the interview by asking David if you had to play a hero in Pendragon. I'm going to jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
That's an excellent question. The answer is no. You don't have to play a hero. The game does not punish you for not engaging in chivalrous deeds. Glory, the central mechanic of the game, the thing that makes your knight notable, is fairly neutral. You do things to earn glory, but you can do things like just defeating enemies or monsters or whatever. That'll get you glory. It doesn't matter what kind of a person you are. There are canonical characters in the Pendragon setting who are like robber knights who have just as much glory as a round table knight, right? Because you can't lose glory. Now, what you can lose is honor. So what the game does say is like, you don't necessarily have to be a hero, but if you go around committing dishonorable acts, that's going to cost you. And eventually, if your honor goes low enough, it's a bit like losing all your sanity in Call of Cthulhu. You lose your character because they're no longer a knight. Honorable deeds are certainly heroic deeds, but dishonorable deeds are something that anyone can commit, either intentionally or unintentionally. And it's something that you have to look out for, regardless of what kind of character you're playing.
So in a conversation like this, where we're talking about heroism in tabletop role-playing games more broadly, we can already see that there's going to be some different categories, talking about honor or talking about glory and all these different things that make up what a hero is. Can you give us like a brief outline of what makes a hero or a good TTRPG character in the broadest sense?
Sure. I mean, I think the definition of a hero is somebody who upholds, their culture's value system, right? So for us, speaking in kind of a Western sense, it's like courage and it's selflessness and it's being helpful to others. These are cultural values that we like to uphold. And so when somebody is sort of ticking all those boxes, oh, what a heroic person that is, what heroic deeds they're committing. And that's, I think, reflected in, obviously like RPGs that are setting up the opportunity to play heroic characters. It's kind of saying like, yeah, if you want to go after that, if you want to be sort of that archetype, then, sometimes it's mechanized, like in Pendragon, like here's some ways you can do that. And other times it's just sort of encouraged, right?
A lot of people, when they think of a goody or heroic character inside a tabletop role-playing game, might think of the lawful good cleric in a game of Dungeons and Dragons. I know a lot of people have a lot of fun playing that class, but I also know there are a lot of people who really don't find that appealing. Can you talk about why heroic virtues and playing this sort of Noblebright character is fun and is exciting, and why these meditations on chivalry that exist inside Pendragon can be so rewarding?
I'm going to try and not ramble about this too much because I actually have very strong feelings on this. This is something I feel very strongly about because I'm Generation X. I definitely grew up in, an environment of like cynicism and irony and ironic detachment and all that kind of stuff, And I think that there's just kind of a general idea that like this goody-goody archetype is uninteresting, it's boring, and so forth. And I suppose at its most extreme level, it is. If you're just playing a one-dimensional character, but that goes for any type, right? Any one-dimensional character is going to be boring, regardless of what that dimension happens to be. But one of my favorite Kurt Vonnegut quotes is, "We are what we pretend to be." Yeah, RPGs are a great format for putting on different skins and like experimenting with what would it be like if I was this type of person or that type of person. You're taking on a persona, right? And it could be like someone who's very sort of morally questionable, or just very selfish in their outlook or whatever. But I think there's a lot of value in exploring what it means to be a hero, because I think the other part of what defines a hero is that it's not easy. It's not an easy road. It's a lot is asked of you as a hero. Sometimes it gets you shunned from your peers or your society. What are you willing to sacrifice in order to be a hero? That's a fascinating question. And just playing a hero or an aspiring hero, it's I don't know, it's something we don't often get to do in our real lives. So, I don't know, if I'm going to spend my time pretending to be somebody else, it's like, yeah, why not pretend to be a hero every once in a while?
I think that my equivalent of that quote would be the Dark Knight's Alfred saying, "It's what we do that defines us." Oh, I probably butchered that quote and maybe misattributed it, but it's from Batman in some way, shape, or form. I want to
Right.
talk about flaws and as they apply to heroes. I know that so often
Hmm.
heroes are not necessarily the biggest or the strongest or the toughest, but they're people who can overcome fear, or they can overcome the desire to take the ring and slip it onto their finger. How does a character's flaw play into their development as a hero?
Speaking of one dimensionality, right? That's exactly how you get away from that, is by introducing flaws. Heroes aren't interesting unless they're battling against both external and internal obstacles. So those internal obstacles should be something that is counter to the heroic persona. And the question is, how do you overcome that, or how do you integrate that into your attempts to be heroic? So in Pendragon, for example, if you want to be a chivalrous knight, you have to get traits, and in sixth edition passions as well, up to a certain level. You can get to that chivalrous knight level, but then if you're proceed to then engage in some unchivalrous actions, you might find those numbers dropping, and boom, you're no longer a chivalrous knight. You can get back to it, of course, but you know obviously you want to maintain it as much as possible. So Pendragon mechanizes it to a certain extent, in terms of like dealing with these flaws. So like you might have a chivalrous knight, but they might have one of their non-chivalrous traits, that is constantly sort of coming up, or like, for example, in sixth edition, there's a new passion called Station, which is sort of like the knight's attitude about where they are on the hierarchy of society. And some knights might have a very high station passion, which would mean that they sort of zealously guard their position as defenders of the realm, and anyone who kind of steps out of that and goes against what they perceive as the natural order. This is not necessarily a positive passion, right? This is something that you could see as like being used to uphold certain like institutions that maybe should change or be modified in some way. But this knight with the high passion is like, no, this is how it's been, and this is how it should remain, and I'm going to be the one to enforce that. So I think there's also that element too, is that heroism can turn towards this kind of stagnant and controlling kind of energy, right? So yeah, it's basically that in and of itself, your aspiration to be the hero. It's the classic hubris situation, right? You're the pride that drives you to become a hero eventually consumes you.
So let me pull things across to some GM advice and some player advice and things like that. When you are trying to play a game and you want heroism to be a feature of the story that you're telling, what kind of adventures or like scenario structures or types of stories do not gel well with exploring the concept of heroism?
I think like the best way to sort of sum that up is just to say, don't place your player characters into these sort of no-win situations consistently. I mean, it can be interesting from time to time. You have to make the impossible choice, save this person or save that person, what's going to happen. But if you're constantly kind of putting them in the way of punishing them for doing heroic deeds, right? you're not really encouraging that type of play. It's it's a balance. It's a fine line between, sort of challenging somebody's aspirations to be a hero and punishing them for it.
What do you do if in a group that you have a couple of players who are focusing on pushing heroism as a story, and then maybe one person in the group, and I'm not trying to say this as a knock on them or as a bad thing, but who is not necessarily interested in exploring that as a character, and because of the way group dynamics in tabletop role-playing games work, can risk sabotaging the arcs of the other characters.
Yeah, so that it's somewhat game dependent, right? So like in a game like 7th where it's like you are playing heroes, capital H heroes. So if somebody is not doing that, then they are being disruptive and they are not playing the game in the spirit that it is being presented. And so that's a player issue. That's a take the player aside and have a chat with them kind of issue. But in a game like Pendragon or RuneQuest, or D&D, you can absolutely, I think, have a mixed group. The classic sort of D&D conundrum, right, is you have the lawful good paladin, and then you have like the chaotic neutral rogue, who's just going around stealing from people and backstabbing people and doing all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, is the paladin supposed to look the other way, or are we going to get into arguments about this? And it really comes down to a question of like mechanics, right? So like in that D&D game, is the dungeon master going to say like, hey, if your paladin is just going to keep looking the other way with this, you're risking your paladinhood. And then that's something that would then be resolved, I think, through role playing in the group, ideally. In Pendragon, you can absolutely have a mix of different knights. You can have the chivalrous knight, and you can have the more practical knight. You can have the knight who's a little bit more kind of the knight of the old ways, might makes right, and that kind of thing. And that could actually like sort of turn into a philosophical debate. But also in Pendragon, it is like objectively better to be a chivalrous knight. Like you get better mechanical benefits from it. Like I said earlier, you don't get punished for being a non-chivalrous knight, but you do get rewarded for being a chivalrous knight. So in that sense, and that really gets into like another aspect of the essence of a hero. It's like, why Captain America is so cool, right? It's the whole lead by example part of heroism, right? So you have the chivalrous knight who's just going around being chivalrous, and wow, look, they've got like more glory than I do. They've got the, special cool abilities that get bestowed on them. They get probably bumped up to the top of the roster for membership on the round table. They're just socially more welcomed in courts and whatnot. I think any time you have like a mix of those different types of characters, if you can have the players approaching it in a way that it's like, hey, it's just different outlooks, different philosophies, let's have a debate about it, like kind of ongoing in the background as we play, that's like the best way to do it. And it helps to highlight the heroism as well, honestly, creates contrast.
Another piece of story or GM focused advice. You mentioned earlier that the hubris of wanting to be a hero can quite often lead to a fall. Do you have any advice for how to include a hero's fall in your game?
Oh yeah, and that really is like kind of the final act of the heroic story. It's sort of the entirety in Call of Cthulhu of, there's a very distinctive version of heroism that emerges when you play Call of Cthulhu, which is the sort of self-sacrificing heroism of, well, if we can just keep the evil at bay for another 20 years, even if it means giving up everything we hold dear, we're going to do it. That's a heroic action, but that's the downfall part of it as well, right? And so, I think that should always factor in either as sort of a recurring beat, kind of a up and down process, like I saying earlier, like maybe you're a chivalrous knight, but then some of your chivalrous traits start to go down because some of your actions, and you're no longer chivalrous, but then you can try and claw your way back. But if it eventually kind of builds to a decision point, right, where it's just like, am I going to sacrifice myself to save my comrades, or am I going to stick to my, my values here, even though it's going to cost me everything? The ultimate arc of the Pendragon campaign is, everything falls apart in the end. Arthur's attempts to, make a better world fall victim to the fallibility of humans. So heroism, ultimately, that sort of quest for heroism then becomes this sort of meditation on humanity and the best part of ourselves, but also the worst part of ourselves. And I really think, without that kind of downfall aspect to it, even if it's just kind of there in the background as a threat, you lose a lot in the heroism part. And I think maybe that's why it has such a bad reputation in RPGs to play the goody-goody, right? Because we don't get that a lot.
A quick addition to this question, because I think it's very related. What about redemption as a theme?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, you can have redemption occur as part of the narrative. You can have it occur afterwards, like in Pendragon, you can actually get posthumous glory awards, like if you die gloriously, you get more glory, which just makes your character that much more famous. And if they maybe leave behind a little kid who then grows up to take their place, they'll get that much more inherited glory off of that, because it's like, oh yeah, I remember your dad. He's the one who died at the bridge, sacrificing himself so that everyone else could get away. So yeah, no, redemption it's not necessary, right? Because you can just have the downfall narrative, but it's really cool if you can work it in.
I want to draw back away from GM advice a little bit and go back into the themes of heroism for a second. And I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but a hero in our world is very different from what a hero is in a tabletop role-playing game, because of course they're games. Can you talk a little bit about that difference?
As I, sort of indicated earlier, real life heroes are often much more flawed than the heroes of our imaginations. There's that bit of advice: never meet your heroes, which sometimes applies, doesn't always apply. In role-playing games, I tend to dwell on that quite as much. There's the downfall aspects, there's the redemption arcs, there's those kinds of things, but there's only so much sort of nuance and complexity one really wants to deal with in a role-playing game, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a game, you're playing it to have fun. Even if you're playing a hero, you're not necessarily going to want to have that hard of a downfall. And again, it's just, if you want to play a heroic character, you want to kind of go all out, right? You want to really, really kind of get into that archetype without overcomplicating it too much, I think.
My final question has to do with one of the points that you raised earlier, where you mentioned that a hero is somebody who embodies the values of their culture, I think is the term that you used. It's a really interesting point. I've had the good fortune recently to play a bunch of games that are set in parts of the world that I haven't visited very much or that I'm not super familiar with. And it's really interesting to explore some of the different values that are central to those societies. Do you have any advice for people who are playing heroic characters in a setting or a location or a culture that they're not necessarily familiar with, but they still want to evoke the heroism of that setting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my advice would just generally be do it if you can, because it is very interesting to explore those spaces. I think there are sort of general qualities that make a hero, right? I don't think there's any culture on the planet that, is wildly different from any, anybody else's. But the nuances vary. For example, in say Russian, legends or folklore or whatever, you'll often kind of note it's a little different here in terms of what these heroes are doing. There's maybe a little bit more emphasis on self-sacrifice than we might see in say British folkloric tradition. Really what that is it's a really fun and interesting gateway into kind of learning about other cultures and their folklore, right? So my advice would just be if you're going to be playing in a game that has kind of a different sort of cultural background, whether it's historically based or it's just sort of a fantasy or sci-fi analog, is just do some reading. Use it as an opportunity to read up on these cultures, do kind of a deep dive in some of their myths and legends, and you'll find also that anthropologists and cultural commentators and stuff will, they love to talk about like what makes a hero in, say, Chinese tradition, and what makes it different. So it's a great opportunity to, if you like to play a hero type, play a different type of hero.